Welcome back to McNulty's Book Grill. Thanks for checking in. Today we are going to talk about two books by Alfred Hayes. Alfred Hayes is an interesting man. There's a lot of facts and some trivia related to his career. I think he's a forgotten writer, one of the forgotten writers. This relates to post-war literature. I have talked about post-war literature in multiple episodes before. It is an area of study that I've been involved in for a number of years. And I read these books several years ago, quite a few actually, and I thought I would bring them into the channel to talk about them a little bit because they're interesting. I have two books and I do have some notes that I jotted down. I went through the books again. I didn't read them completely again, but I read sections of them and I took some notes on it. It's interesting to me. Certain books, when you read them, you never forget them. And the two books we'll talk about today by Alfred Hayes are those types of books for me. I read them a long time ago, and I've kept them, and I've never forgotten the emotional impact that they had on me. And, you get an emotional impact. You get an intellectual impact with things. You relate to them in certain ways. So these are two that I will. The first one is All Thy Conquests, which is, here's the cover of it. Both books are World War II books. Alfred Hayes was stationed in Italy during World War II, and he stayed in Italy after that, and he began working in the Italian cinema. We'll talk about that in a minute, a little more. So, All Thy Conquests was published in 1946, and this is the 1958 paperback. His style is not unlike Hemingway, Steinbeck, who were the two alpha male writers from this period that influenced everybody, and it was inescapable, especially Hemingway. You couldn't escape from Hemingway, who began publishing in the 20s, and by 1940 or so, when he did For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway was the number one alpha male writer in the world. There are many others. I've talked about alpha male writers before. We'll be talking about alpha female writers soon. And anyways, for me, Hemingway, guys like Irwin Shaw, we're talking about post-war literature. Hemingway never really wrote a great World War II novel. Irwin Shaw did with The Young Lions. Hemingway did Across the River and Into the Trees, which I'm going to cover later. I am going to do an episode on Hemingway finally. He's right over there on my shelf. All right, Alfred Hayes. Alfred Hayes did this. He did these books, obviously, after and while he's in Italy. He used his experiences as a soldier in World War II in Italy to create some remarkable works of fiction. I would argue that this does belong with The Young Lions as an interesting book. The locations, so the book alternates in chapters between characters and some locations, and it becomes, for me, it becomes a work of absurdity. Absurdity is a literary trend. Franz Kafka's The Trial is absurdist literature, and he in this book, because Italy was a fascist country, and we all know what happened to Mussolini at the end of World War II. There's enough video and photographs of that to remind us that the population rose up against the government at the end of World War II, and they murdered Mussolini and his wife. And there was a lot of discussion on fascism, and this book discusses fascism as Hayes encountered it in Italy. Here's a quote from page 45. He encapsulates the Italian dilemma. Again, he's living in Italy after World War II and working in the Italian cinema. It's fascinating. Here is Hayes quoting a quote from the book on one of the characters saying, "We are no longer religious. We are only political. Fascism, it appears, is acceptable until the Allied liberation of Rome." So then it becomes another thing entirely. He says that on page 45, The people that embraced Mussolini and his policies were often executed after the war. Excuse me. Italy in post-war years was not necessarily a pleasant vacation location. He doesn't shy away from the reality of what he witnessed in this. He has another quote here, which talks about the effect of a corrupt political machine on the Italian people. Here's the quote. The disenchantment with the experience of anti-fascism has made the people suspicious of all parties, all organizations. And this is someone talking in the book. We are tired of them. Tired of the professionals who run them for their own profit. Tired of tragedies of power and the comedies of factionalism. The Italian soul is exhausted. Is an exhausted soul, a soul which has been seduced, betrayed, and kicked out into the streets to horror. Very, very rough language in this book. Realism plays a strong part in what Hayes is basically reporting on as a work of fiction. It is a fascinating book to read. It's not necessarily an easy book to read. So this idea of absurdity. So Hayes is working on Italian films. He's working with Vittorio De Sica in The Bicycle Thief. I know you film buffs are familiar with this. On American television, when he returned, he worked on Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, and Mannix. Alfred Hayes is a very interesting man. And his ideas are always ultra-realism, really. Sometimes absurd, sometimes just a really hard dose of realism. And All Thy Conquests is that type of realism. And it's not a short book either. I wanted to comment on the lurid paperback cover. So, focusing on SEX, focusing on the sex act, the Italians were trying to survive. This is a common story on occupied countries. And then the liberators came and were given gifts of many types, let's say. It's a brutal reality. It's a heartbreaking reality. It is, I don't know, there's a trial section in here that is a real strong dose of reality. In Italy, these are not things that people normally talk about when they're talking about the Allied troops coming into Rome, for example. Both of the books today we're talking about, by the way, take place in Rome. The generic, common, sanitized version of this is that the liberators came, the Allied troops came, American, British, Australian, and Scottish, and everybody, whatever they were, Canadian, and they came to Italy, and they were liberators, and they were greeted with open arms. All of that is true, but it's slightly sanitized. The actual reality, when you read this book, you're going to get a better dose of reality on what this is really like. The complexity of it, nothing is black and white, nothing is cut and dry. It's a good book. I think it's a great post-war work. It may be his best post-war work. We're going to get to the other one in a minute here. So if you find this paperback on the market, I would recommend reading it if you have an interest in history as it's expressed through post-war fiction. Again, this is a work of fiction, although clearly based upon his first-hand experiences in Rome after the war ended. He stayed in Rome, and as I said, he worked in Italy for many years. So, kind of a forgotten book, a forgotten author, during a very interesting and tragic time in world history. All Thy Conquest by Alfred Hayes, a forgotten writer. Now, let's get to the next one. All right, so here we go on the next one, The Girl on the Via Flaminia by Alfred Hayes, 1950 paperback. This is a pocket paperback. The other one was what was this? This was a pyramid paperback. Then we have a pocket paperback. And this is an interesting book. The cover painting on this is credited to John Northcross. There is a blurb in this book by Kenneth Fearing. Most of you, I'll bet, don't know who Kenneth Fearing was. Kenneth Fearing is alive on my bookshelf in the other room. A lot of trivia. You can look up Kenneth Fearing on your own. I told you there's a lot of facts and trivia involved with Alfred Hayes. This book was made into a film starring Kirk Douglas. Now this is trivia. Act of Love was the name of that film, and it was a 1953 film. It's an excellent film. I think the book is just as good as the film. It's a stunning film to watch. Again, post-war films, post-war literature go hand in hand if you're going to study that area. So the screenplay on Act of Love was by Joseph Kessel, and guess who? Irwin Shaw. So there's a lot to be said for Act of Love with Kirk Douglas. The ending is powerhouse. It's different than the book. The ending of the film has a one line of dialogue that's shocking and brings the story together. It's a superb film, and if you get a chance for you film buffs up there, I would recommend you watch it. Read the book too. Little different approach here. The book takes place in Rome. The film takes place in Paris. So that was a necessary change that they felt. I think Kirk Douglas had something to do with that. The novel's ending is ambiguous, and in the film, of course, you're going to get that punchline, which is pretty well known for film buffs, on Act of Love. Hemingway's influence on the prose style is readily apparent here in this book as well. This is a very good book. I really like both of these books. They're both good examples of post-war literature. The book is about a guy named Robert who falls in love with Elisa in Rome during the occupation. It's a love story, but it's not a romantic love story. It's a realistic love story about men and women and how they get together and the things that they do. I think Alfred Hayes avoids those plot traps of making it into a lurid, sexual, explicit story, although that's clearly what's going on here. So don't make any mistake about these books. He doesn't sugarcoat it. There was a lot happening in here. So there's a quote here I wanted to read. That's why I'm looking at my notes. The character of Robert's trying to understand Lisa and the world she lives in. Again, keep in mind that these soldiers had not traveled the world like people travel today. Most of the Allied troops had never been to Italy. And so they're learning a new culture, completely different type of environment than they're accustomed to. So Robert is trying to understand Lisa. He's making an effort to understand where he is, who she is, what their world is like. They're going to be liberated. And he says this, this is what he says. He says, she stands there, this is a quote from the book, she stands there, Robert thought, like a collection of bad knowledge. It's a stunning line in the book. I actually underlined it in pencil. The mother tells Robert that he's a soldier and soldiers are always innocent. That's kind of true in some ways, but then Robert questions himself. How do I know who these people are? How do I know what she is? How do I know I'm not being taken? So he's suspicious. Again, a dose of reality here in the post-war environment of Rome. So a little more trivia about Alfred Hayes. I'm recommending both of these books. Alfred Hayes is known for these books and some of the other things, his work in television and film, as I mentioned. There's something else that he's known for. It's kind of interesting. He's known for a poem that he wrote called I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill last night. Joe Hill was and that became a popular folk song by Earl Robertson. Joe Hill was a laborer who was executed in 1915 because he was implicated in a murder. There's a lot of history about that. There's a lot of speculation whether he was innocent or guilty. Joe Hill, when I say the name Joe Hill, I know a lot of you are thinking about Stephen King's son. Stephen King's son took his pen name from his middle initial, which I think is Hillstrom. So it would be Joseph Hillstrom King, and he changed it to Joe Hill. I am confident that Stephen King's son, Joe Hill, and Stephen King himself are well acquainted with the poem I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill Last Night in the Song. These are guys that read everything they can get their hands on. Some of you may not be familiar with that, so I'll leave it to you to follow the trail of American history before it's all lost like Joe Hill's ashes on the wind. And when you look up Joe Hill, as you're going to look up Kenneth Fearing, I think I'm leaving it to you to do that, because I thought I would just get bogged down in trivia if I told you every little thing connected with Alfred Hayes in these books. Look them up, and it takes you down a trail of enlightenment and knowledge. I hope this is simple. I hope it comes across as a simple episode, but these are not simple books. All Thy Conquests and The Girl on the Via Flaminia by the great Alfred Hayes, a forgotten writer. Until next time, my friends, stay well, stay happy. Feed your brains. Read a book.